At minus 35 degrees Celsius, they left an elderly couple out in the woods to freeze. Their faint cries vanished into the wind and snow, and no one knew they were there. But at that exact moment, a Navy SEAL came home and realized this was revenge. His German shepherd suddenly froze, ears up, then sprinted into the trees like he'd caught a desperate scent. He chased those paw prints and found a truth that stole his breath. Stay until the end, because what happens next is beyond anything you'd expect. Where are you watching from? And how did this story make you feel? Comment below, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep sharing more stories like this. At noon, the snow around Iron Haven didn't look white. It looked polished, as if the sky had taken a whetstone to the world and sharpened every edge until light could cut. A German shepherd exploded off the porch like a released arrow. Kepler, 6 years old, black and tan, with a dark saddle across his back, moved with the quiet power of a working dog who didn't waste motion. Broad chest, upright ears, amber brown eyes that seemed to count heartbeats. He didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He ran as if the wind had whispered his name, and he owed it an answer. Between his teeth was a torn strip of reflective mylar, thin as fish scale, flashing silver gold in the sun. Behind him, the man stepping out of the truck froze mid-breath. Carter Voss stood a touch under the open door frame, tall enough that the truck looked smaller beside him. About 6 feet 3 inches, 1.90 meters, built lean and hard, the kind of strength that lived in tendons and patience instead of show. His face was clean-shaven, razor close, leaving nothing to hide the square jaw and sharp cheekbones. Dark brown hair lay cropped in a military cut, just a fraction longer than strict SEAL standard. Like he'd allowed himself one small rebellion and then apologized for it. His skin was light but weathered by northern wind, the cold giving him that permanent outdoorsman burn. His eyes were gray-blue, not bright, not dull, steel left out under winter sun. He wore the same thing he always wore now, as if changing clothes might break whatever fragile order he'd built. An old olive and army gray tactical combat shirt, fabric softened by years, frayed at the cuffs and shoulders, faded in patches from too many washes and too much weather. Worn earth brown and moss green combat pants with scuffed knees and slightly sagging cargo pockets. Old military work boots and an old military watch that still kept time like a stubborn oath. Carter watched Kepler's jaws in the shimmering scrap. That mylar didn't belong to their porch. Not to their house. Not to any sane afternoon. Kepler stopped at the bottom step and lifted his head, offering the strip without quite offering it, like a messenger who expected the king to already understand the message. Carter reached out. Kepler didn't drop it until Carter's fingers were close enough to feel the dog's warm breath. The mylar was cold, the way metal feels cold even in sunshine. And under the cold was something else. Faint, sharp, wrong. A smell like new plastic and machine oil. Carter's stomach tightened, the way it used to before a door blew open on the other side of the world. He swallowed and told himself not to do it, not to time travel into fear, but the body remembered faster than the mind. Kepler's ears angled toward the tree line, and Carter's gaze followed. The forest stood there in its winter uniform, tall cedars and dark pines, their shadows long and blue on the bright ground. The sun made everything look holy, and that was the problem. Sometimes the prettiest scenes were the ones that lied. Only hours earlier, Carter had been far from Iron Haven's shimmering calm. The operation had ended the way clean operations ended. Fast, precise, and quiet enough that the world could pretend nothing ugly had happened. They'd taken Darius Halcrow in a warehouse that smelled like cardboard and cold money. Halcrow wasn't a giant, but he carried himself like one. Late 40s, hair salt and pepper, and combed as if he expected a camera. A face built of polite angles, eyes sharp as broken glass. He wore expensive restraint the way some men wore armor. No shouting, no flailing, just a calm that suggested he'd already planned for every ending. Carter had seen Halcrow's type before, men who didn't threaten with fists because they threatened with systems. In the holding room afterward, Halcrow sat with his hands folded, posture perfect, like a banker waiting for a meeting. Carter stood across from him, arms relaxed, gaze steady, voice flat. He didn't taunt. He didn't celebrate. He'd learned years ago that victories enjoyed too loudly had a way of turning into funerals. Halcrow smiled anyway. It wasn't warm. It was measured. "You did it," Halcrow said, almost admiring. "You closed the net." Carter didn't answer. Halcrow tilted his head, studying him the way a jeweler studied a stone for flaws. "You look like a man who thinks winning ends the story." Carter's jaw tightened. "It does for you." Halcrow's smile thinned. "No." He glanced down at Carter's watch, then back up. "It ends for the version of you that still believes in ends." Carter felt something old rise in his chest, anger, yes, but also that quieter thing, the fear of being known by someone he didn't respect. Halcrow leaned forward a fraction, voice dropping as if sharing a secret between gentlemen. "You should call your mother," he said. Carter's eyes didn't move. Halcrow's smile returned, slow as frost spreading across glass. "Tell her you're coming. Tell her." He paused. Then he gave a small shrug, as if the rest wasn't worth saying aloud. "Well, tell her what you want. The wind gets loud in the north." Carter left the room without another word, but the sentence followed him anyway, padding behind him like a shadow that refused to stay on the floor. He drove back to Iron Haven with the radio off, not because he wanted silence. Silence was where memories did their best work, but because the static between stations sounded too much like distant fire. The road through Upper Michigan had its own mythology, pines like cathedral columns, snowfields like blank pages, a lake horizon that looked like a god's eyelid closed against the world. Carter used to love it here. Or maybe he'd loved the idea of it, a place where cold was honest. Now the cold felt like an audience. He pulled into his parents' drive and felt the familiar tug of small things. The mailbox leaning slightly left, the porch steps worn smooth by decades of boots, the old wind chime that sounded like someone gently knocking on glass. His father, Gordon Voss, had built that porch with hands that still looked like tools, thick knuckles, scarred fingertips, nails permanently marked by labor. Gordon was in his late 60s, shoulders slightly sloped from years in a mine, and then years fixing everything that broke afterward. He didn't do big emotion. He did presence. He'd greet Carter later with a grip that meant you're real. His mother, Marion Voss, was the opposite kind of strong, mid-60s, smaller, quick-eyed, the kind of woman who used humor the way other people use blankets, covering the draft before anyone admitted the room was cold. She'd tease Carter for forgetting to bring pie and then tuck an extra scarf into his coat like it was a sacred ritual. Carter expected to see her in the kitchen window. Instead, he saw Kepler, and Kepler was carrying a piece of shining trouble. Carter's phone vibrated in his pocket as he stood on the porch, the mylar strip trembling between his fingers like a nervous coin. Unknown number. He answered without saying hello. For a moment, there was only breathing, not heavy, not fast, careful, like the person was trying not to be heard by anyone else in the room. Then a voice, calm and clipped, spoke one line that felt like a hand closing around Carter's throat. "Rook Actual," the voice said, Carter's old call sign, buried in paperwork and memory. "Don't call the sheriff. Don't trust anyone wearing a badge. And don't—" A sound cut in, a faint metallic clunk, like a key turned in a lock. The voice continued, lower now. "Don't trust the sunlight." Carter's fingers tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" Silence. Then the line went dead, cleanly, like someone had snuffed a candle with two fingers. Carter stared at the screen. No callback, no trace, just the buzzing absence of an answer. Kepler pressed his shoulder against Carter's thigh, a steady weight that said, "Here, now." Carter crouched and scratched behind Kepler's ear, a small motion that felt like prayer. The dog's fur was cold at the tips, warm underneath, damp with melted snow. Kepler's eyes didn't look frightened. They looked certain. Carter stood and tried his mother again. Straight to voicemail. He listened, breath shallow, as if the air itself might break if he pulled too hard. Marion's voice came on, strained but still Marion, trying to keep the corners of fear folded neatly. "Hey, honey, listen. A gust of wind swept through the receiver. Something banged, metal against metal. Connie, Kate, and then the message ended in abrupt silence, as if the phone had fallen, or been taken, or simply decided it couldn't carry the rest. Carter didn't move for a full second. He'd faced gunfire without flinching, but the sound of his mother's voice stopping mid-syllable hit him in a place armor never reached. He turned slowly, scanning the yard. The snow glittered. Birds hopped on a bare branch. The day wore innocence like a costume. Kepler stared toward the tree line, ears tall, body angled forward. Carter followed the dog's gaze and felt the old instinct rise again, clean and cold. The sense that something was wrong, not because he could see it, but because he couldn't. He looked down at the mylar strip again. It shimmered like a tiny torn piece of a rescue blanket, like something meant to keep a body warm. His chest tightened. In the distance, the wind chime on the porch gave one soft note, bright and thin, like a coin dropped into an empty cup. Carter exhaled through his teeth and tried to make the world normal by naming normal things. "Dad?" he called. No answer. The house stood quiet, windows reflecting blue sky, as if it had never heard a bad word spoken in it. Carter stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee that had cooled too long. The kitchen light was off. A dish towel lay folded on the counter, too neat, as if Marion had set it down and promised herself she'd be right back. Kepler padded in behind him, nails clicking softly on the wood, head low and purposeful. He moved room to room without panic, searching, checking, returning, like a soldier clearing corners. He stopped at the garage door and sniffed along the seam. His nose lingered there. The same sharp scent rose again. New plastic, machine oil. Carter's pulse ticked faster, steady as his old watch. He opened the garage door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the clean sting of snow and the faintest trace of something else. Exhaust, recent. The garage was empty except for Gordon's tools and the old snowblower. But on the concrete, near the workbench, lay a scrap of the same reflective mylar. And beside it, a tiny, fresh smear of dirt mixed with ice crystals, like someone had tracked in something not from their yard. Kepler's tail lifted slightly, then stilled. He turned his head toward the forest again, not frantic, not confused, like a compass needle snapping to north. Carter felt the line from Hal Crow's mouth crawl back into his thoughts. Call your mother. The wind gets loud in the north. He swallowed, tasting metal. He reached for his jacket pocket and checked the familiar shapes. Knife, flashlight, gloves. Small comforts. Old rituals. He told himself he was overreacting. He told himself Marion probably slipped outside to check the generator, and Gordon probably followed, and the phone probably cut out because of the cold. He told himself 100 lies in the space of one heartbeat. Kepler didn't believe any of them. The dog walked back to the porch, sat at the top step, and looked up at Carter with an expression that was almost comic in its bluntness, like a very serious creature watching a human fail a simple test. Carter huffed a quiet, humorless laugh. "Okay," he murmured, and it came out like surrender. "Okay, you win." Kepler stood immediately, as if that was the password. He nudged Carter's hand with his muzzle, gentle, insistent, and then trotted down the steps toward the tree line, leaving a crisp set of paw prints on the glittering snow. Carter followed, not because he understood, because he trusted the only creature on the property that looked like it did. Behind them, the house remained still. Ahead, the forest waited, dark and patient beneath the beautiful, lying sun. And Carter Voss, who had spent a career kicking down doors, stepped off his porch as if stepping into a story he hadn't chosen. A story his dog had already started to read. Kepler did not sprint into the trees like a dog chasing a rabbit. Kepler moved like a dog following a decision. Snow crunched under his paws with a soft, steady rhythm. His black and tan coat drank sunlight along the dark saddle of his back, the fur at his neck lifting as the wind changed direction. Every few yards he stopped, head tilted, nose high, tasting the air the way a sommelier tasted wine, searching for the note that didn't belong. Carter Voss followed 2 steps behind, boots pressing deep into the glittering surface. The bright noon made the forest look harmless, almost staged. Pine trunks stood like pillars. Shadows lay long and blue. It was the kind of beauty that could convince a man to forget danger existed. Carter didn't forget. Not anymore. He kept his shoulders loose, his breath controlled. That old military watch on his wrist ticked on, stubborn as habit. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout names into the trees. He listened, because listening had saved him more times than luck ever did. Kepler slowed, then veered left, away from the neat line of the driveway, toward a shallow dip where drifts gathered like folded blankets. Carter saw nothing at first. Then he saw the difference, a faint scuff in the snow, not a footprint exactly, more like a place where the surface had been disturbed and then dusted over again, and beneath it a trace of darker grit. Road sand, the kind the county scattered when the ice turned mean. Kepler sniffed once and kept moving. Carter's throat tightened. His parents' house was back there. Warm wood and familiar creaks and the quiet reassurance of decades. The forest ahead was a mouth. He forced himself to stop and look back. The porch was still visible through the trees, a pale rectangle of steps and railing. The wind chime hung there, motionless, pretending it had never made a sound in its life. Carter's phone sat heavy in his pocket. He didn't take it out. Not yet. He told himself he needed proof first. Something real enough to hold in his hands and say, "This is why I'm afraid." Because fear without proof felt too much like memory. Kepler reached the edge of the tree line and stepped onto something harder than snow. A narrow service road cut through the woods, a pale scar under a thin dusting, just visible where tires had packed it down. The surface was a mix of old gravel and frozen slush. A line of cedar branches bowed over it like a low ceiling. Kepler stood at the road and looked back at Carter, ears upright, eyes steady. "This is where it changes," his gaze said. Carter stepped onto the road and felt the difference under his boot, the subtle slickness of ice over packed grit. He crouched, ran a gloved finger over a shallow indentation. Not a clear tread, but the hint of one. Recent. The wind carried a whisper of something that didn't belong in pure pine air. Exhaust. Faint, already thinning, like a ghost leaving the room. Carter straightened slowly. He didn't like the road. Roads meant intention. Roads meant someone had chosen a direction and expected to return. Kepler lowered his head and moved along the edge where snow met packed slush, tracking with patience. He didn't lunge. He didn't pull. He worked the way a good dog did when the world was confusing and the only honest thing was scent. They went 50 yards before Kepler stopped. He pawed once at a bank of snow near a downed branch, then stepped aside like a performer, revealing a trick. Something dark lay half buried. A glove. Not one of Gordon's heavy work gloves, the kind that looked like they'd been dipped in years of grease and stubbornness. This glove was slimmer, synthetic, newer, black with a small strip of reflective tape on the cuff. Carter picked it up carefully. The material was stiff from cold but not brittle. Inside, it smelled like clean plastic and machine oil, familiar now, like a song he didn't want stuck in his head. Kepler sniffed the glove once and huffed, a small sound of disapproval. Carter's gaze lifted to the trees beyond the road. Somewhere ahead, the world was doing something it had no right to do, staying calm. He turned back toward the house. Kepler did not protest. He followed close, shoulder-brushing Carter's leg once, as if to remind him that retreat wasn't defeat. It was strategy. The house looked normal from the outside. That was its cruelest talent. Carter stepped onto the porch and felt the boards give their familiar creak under his weight. The air smelled like cold cedar and distant lake ice. He opened the door and the warmth inside met him, soft, domestic, almost offended that he had ever doubted it. And then he noticed what the warmth didn't carry. No kitchen smell, no coffee, no soup, no faint butter-on-pan scent that clung to Marion's curtains even after the dishes were done. The house felt rinsed, like someone had wiped the air clean. Carter stood in the entryway and let the quiet settle on his shoulders. Kepler patted in, nails clicking softly on wood, then stopped near the kitchen threshold. He sniffed the air and sneezed once, sharp, irritated. Carter moved through the living room. Everything was in place. The throw blanket folded, the family photos lined up like witnesses. Marion's favorite mug sat by the sink, dry, as if it had been washed and set down with intention. But the details were wrong in small ways. A chair pulled out at an angle, a dish towel folded too neatly, like someone had done it in a hurry to look calm. The old landline phone off its hook by a fraction, not dangling, just not seated right. Carter's pulse quickened. He walked to the window and looked out at the driveway again, searching for movement. Nothing. Only sunlight on snow. Only the world pretending. He opened the garage door and the cold air rushed in. Tools hung in disciplined rows on the pegboard. The snowblower sat like a sleeping beast. On the floor near the workbench, the second scrap of mylar still lay where he'd seen it earlier, gleaming faintly like a scale from something that lived underwater. Kepler stepped into the garage, nose low. He traced the seam along the concrete where the garage met the threshold. He paused by the base of the workbench and sniffed harder, as if the scent there spoke a dialect only he understood. Then he backed up and sat. He looked at Carter, then at the workbench, then at the door leading out to the side yard, a triangle of attention. Carter followed it. Outside, the side yard was a flat expanse of glittering snow, broken by a narrow path of shoveled ice leading to the back porch. The shed sat to the left, door shut. The woodpile was stacked. Everything looked cared for. Kepler moved toward the mailbox at the end of the drive. Carter frowned. The mailbox was ordinary. White paint, the flag slightly bent from years of winter. But Kepler stopped there with the seriousness of a priest at an altar. He sniffed the post, then the metal box, then the base where it met the snow, and then, with a delicate precision that didn't match his size, he pawed once at the drift. Something clinked faintly beneath the powder. Carter knelt and brushed snow aside with his glove. A key lay there, a ymer, brass cold with a simple stamped tag. No house key, no car fob, a utility-style key, old but not ancient, the kind that belonged to padlocks and service doors and places people didn't visit unless they needed to. Kepler stared at the key as if he'd been staring at it for a long time. Carter picked it up. The metal bit his fingers through the glove, the chill sharp. He turned it over. The tag had letters and numbers stamped into it. CL-17. He didn't know what CL-17 meant, but Kepler did something Carter couldn't ignore. The dog lifted his head and looked straight toward the far end of the service road, past the trees, past the visible world, toward a direction that felt chosen. And Carter, against his own pride, felt something in his chest soften into something close to belief. Not superstition, not magic, just the quiet truth that some creatures heard the world more clearly than humans did. A vehicle crunched into the driveway. Carter rose, key in hand, body already squared to threat. A dark SUV rolled to a stop. A woman stepped out, tall and solid in a winter sheriff's jacket the color of midnight. Her hair was brown, pulled back tight, practical. Her face was all clean lines and careful restraint, freckles faint across one cheek, a small scar at her chin like a punctuation mark on a story she didn't tell strangers. Sheriff Tamsin Lark moved with the calm authority of someone who had spent years walking into rooms where everyone else wanted to walk out. Her eyes were a hard green-gray, the kind that missed nothing and forgave little. She didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't flinch at Kepler's response. She just watched Carter's stance and understood instantly that this wasn't a man calling over a lost wallet. "You're Carter Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. Carter nodded once. "My parents are missing." Tamsin's gaze flicked to the porch, the open door, the stillness of the house. She inhaled, subtle, and Carter realized she was doing her own version of Kepler's work, reading the air. "Tell me what you know," she said. Her voice was steady, low, the voice of someone who had learned that panic was contagious. Carter kept it short. The missing smell, the odd scraps, the glove, the service road. He didn't add poetry. He didn't add fear. He didn't mention Hal Crow's smile. Tamsin listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once, as if adding his facts to a filing cabinet in her mind. "Who else lives with you?" she asked. "No one," Carter said. "Just them and Kepler." At his name, Kepler's ears twitched. The dog stepped to Carter's side and stood there like a shadow that chose loyalty over comfort. Tamsin's gaze softened a fraction, so small it might have been imagined. "Good," she said. "He's working." She stepped closer to the mailbox. She saw the disturbed snow and the empty groove where the key had been. Her eyes lifted to Carter's hand. "What's that?" she asked. Carter held the key up. "He found it." Tamsin took it carefully, turning it between gloved fingers. She read the tag, CL-17. Something passed behind her eyes, quick as a cloud-crossing sun. "That's not yours," she said. "No," Carter replied. "What is it?" "So." Tamsin looked toward the trees, then back at Carter. Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders tightened, a subtle admission that the day had just become heavier. "Ironhaven used to have a decommissioned utility shack off Cedar Line," Schwan said. "Old service station for the power corridor and the mining remnant sites. Most folks forgot it exists." She paused. The pause was not dramatic. It was professional, like she was choosing her next words to fit a legal form. Then she said very carefully, "That key belongs to a place no one should be accessing without permission." Kepler took one step forward and stared at the road again. Carter felt the weight of the key settle into the center of the story like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't ask the obvious question, "Why would my parents have a key to that?" Because the obvious questions were often traps. Instead, he asked the one that mattered. "Are we going now?" Carter said. Tamsin studied him, his height, his controlled breathing, the way he didn't fidget even when fear was burning a hole through him. "You're not deputized," she said. "You don't touch anything I tell you not to touch. You don't step ahead of me. Understood?" Carter's jaw flexed. "Understood." Tamsin nodded once. "Good." She looked at Kepler again, and for a moment her stern face cracked just enough to show something human under it. "And your dog," she said, "it stays close. If he's pointing us somewhere, I want to see what he sees." Kepler, as if he understood he'd been promoted to guide, huffed softly and turned toward the service road. The wind lifted the porch chime and made it ring once, bright, thin, unresolved. Carter slid the key back into his pocket, feeling its cold shape against his palm, like a promise he hadn't agreed to make. Then he stepped off the porch beside Sheriff Tamsin Lark, with Kepler leading them toward the cedar shadows, toward a place the town had forgotten, but the dog had not. The service road looked harmless from a distance, just a pale ribbon of packed snow stitched between cedar trunks. Up close, it felt like a decision someone had already made. Sheriff Tamsin Lark walked first, boots finding the firmest line near the shoulder, her winter jacket dark against the bright spill of noon. She carried herself the way people did when they'd learned the world could tilt without warning. Chin level, shoulders squared, eyes scanning not for drama, but for detail. Carter Voss kept pace beside her, tall and controlled in his worn olive gray tactical shirt and faded combat pants. The cold tried to bite through the softened fabric at his cuffs and shoulders, but he didn't react. His body ran on discipline, the kind you built by repeating the same calm breath until panic stopped asking to be invited in. Kepler led them in front, 6-year-old German shepherd, black and tan coat with a dark saddle, ears upright like antennae. He didn't pull, he didn't race. He moved as if he were reading a sentence written in scent, one word at a time, and he refused to skip lines. Every so often, Kepler stopped and lifted his nose into the air. He tested the wind, then he chose a direction again. "It's close," Tamsin said quietly, not as a promise, but as a practical note. "Cedar Line's less than a mile from here." Carter didn't answer. His jaw was tight, clean-shaven face cut sharp in the sunlight. Gray-blue eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, as if staring hard enough might force the world to give back what it had taken. Kepler paused beside a shallow drift where the packed road met a patch of glittering powder. He sniffed once, then circled. Carter saw it a heartbeat later, a thin strip of sand embedded in the snow, the kind that came off county trucks. That meant tires had been here, recently enough that the sand hadn't sunk or scattered. Kepler moved on. A power corridor appeared ahead, tall poles and lines cutting through the trees like a stern rule. The sun flashed off the wires in bright pinpoints, And for a second, Carter thought of old stories where gods made roads in the sky and punished men for looking up. He forced himself to blink. This wasn't myth. This was Michigan. This was winter. This was his life, narrowing to a single question. Where are they? They rounded a bend and the forest opened into a wider cut of land. A vehicle sat half off the road, angled toward the trees like it had tried to hide and failed. Gordon Voss's SUV. Carter's lungs locked for an instant, as if fear had closed a fist around his ribs. The SUV's windows were faintly fogged on the inside. Not thick fog, just the light haze of warmth that hadn't yet surrendered to the cold. Tamsin lifted a hand, stopping Carter with a small, firm gesture. "Don't touch it," she said. Carter's fingers flexed at his sides. His old military watch ticked like it was counting down something he didn't want to name. Kepler approached first, slow and cautious. He sniffed the rear tire, then the driver's door seam. His tail held steady, neither tucked nor wagging, neutral, working. He moved to the front grille and sniffed again, then turned his head toward the trees. Tamsin circled the SUV, eyes narrowing at the small details. The exhaust pipe held a faint crust of melted ice. The hood was cold now, but not the deep cold of something left overnight. "Remote start," she said, more to herself than to Carter. "In weather like this, folks use it. Someone could have triggered it minutes ago, or it could have cycled and shut off." Carter swallowed. "That means they were here." "It means the vehicle was warm recently," Tamsin corrected, careful with language the way sheriffs were careful with evidence. "Which might mean they were here, or they wanted it to look like they were." Carter looked at the fogged windows again. His mother hated fogged windows. Marion would always wipe the inside glass with the sleeve of her coat and mutter, half joking, half scolding, "If you can't see, you can't pray properly." The thought hit him so hard it almost felt like laughter. Almost. He didn't laugh. He couldn't. Tamsin crouched near the driver's side door and studied the snow. "Tire tracks," she murmured. "But look, the edges are messy, like it rolled slowly, then stopped." She straightened, took out her phone, and snapped photos. Methodical, quiet, no theatrics, just the kind of care that said she'd seen cases fall apart because someone wanted to be a hero instead of a witness. Carter stood still, fighting the urge to grab the handle and rip the door open. Kepler broke the stalemate. The dog stepped to the passenger side, nose pressed low along the rocker panel. He inhaled, then shifted, sniffing higher, tasting the air that leaked from the car's seams. He huffed once. A small sound of displeasure. Then he turned away from the SUV and trotted 10 feet into the trees, stopping beside a snowbank where the powder looked slightly darker, like someone had disturbed it and the cold hadn't had time to cover the lie. Kepler pawed once, twice. Snow flew up in a glittering spray. Something black surfaced, a slim synthetic glove with reflective tape on the cuff. The same style Carter had found earlier, but this one was damp at the fingertips, as if it had been worn. Tamsin's gaze sharpened. "Good boy," she said, not in baby talk, but like a professional acknowledging another professional. Carter's mouth tightened. He watched her reach into her jacket and pull out an evidence bag. A crackle sounded from Tamsin's shoulder radio. She pressed the talk button. "Lark to dispatch. I need a unit and an evidence kit at Cedar Line Access. Also, tell Deputy Cray to bring a camera and flags." Static answered, then a clipped voice. "Copy, Sheriff. Deputy Cray en route." Carter glanced at Tamsin. "Deputy Cray?" "He's my paperwork conscience," she said dryly. The faintest hint of humor touched her voice like sunlight touching ice. "Keeps me honest." Carter almost smiled. Almost. Tamsin bagged the glove without letting it touch her bare hands. "This stays sealed, understood?" Carter nodded. Kepler didn't wait for permission. He moved farther into the trees, then stopped abruptly and looked up. Not at the power lines, not at a bird, at something Carter couldn't see. Carter followed the dog's line of sight and frowned. There, between two cedar trunks, was a small black box strapped to a tree at eye level, partially camouflaged with branches. A trail camera. Its tiny red indicator blinked once, patient as a heartbeat. For a moment, Carter felt the world tilt. Not from cold, but from the sick clarity of being watched. The blinking red dot wasn't threatening in the way a weapon was threatening. It was worse. It was proof of intention. Someone had wanted eyes here. Someone had wanted a record. Someone had wanted the story told a certain way. Carter's mind flashed images without his permission. A frame of him opening a car door, his fingerprints on a handle, his silhouette bending into the driver's seat, a clip edited, a narrative shaped, the kind of trap that didn't need violence because it used reputation as the knife. Kepler gave a low, warning growl, not loud, not aggressive, more like a guardian reminding the world he was present. Tamsin's face went still. "That shouldn't be there," she said quietly. "How do you know?" Carter asked, voice tight. "Because I'd have seen it," she replied, gaze locked on the camera. "And because Cedar Line isn't a hunting blind. No one sets us up out here for deer. Not like that. Not pointed at the road." She stepped closer, careful not to disturb the snow around the tree. She photographed the camera in place, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small tool, cutting the strap with controlled precision. She held the device like it was fragile evidence and dangerous truth at the same time. Carter stared at it. His throat felt raw. Kepler oddly sat down directly in the camera's former line of sight and stared back at where it had been, as if to say, "I see you too." For the first time since the house had gone wrong, Carter felt a strange flicker of something under his fear. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. A belief that he wasn't walking into darkness alone. A distant engine sound floated up the service road, then grew louder. A county vehicle appeared around the bend, tires crunching over packed snow. It rolled to a stop beside Tamsin's SUV, and a man stepped out carrying an evidence kit and a camera case. Deputy Gideon Cray looked mid-30s, average height, lean build under his uniform coat. His hair was sandy brown, kept short, and he wore neatly trimmed stubble that made him look older when he frowned, which he did often, as if the world's paperwork was constantly behind schedule. His skin was pale with a winter flush across his nose and cheeks. His eyes were sharp, the color of weak coffee, and they moved quickly, taking inventory the way some people took breaths. "Sheriff," Gideon said, nodding at Tamsin. His tone was respectful but brisk. Then his gaze flicked to Carter. It lingered on the military posture, controlled stance, stillness that wasn't relaxed but trained. "And you must be Voss," Gideon added, voice careful, not hostile, just aware that men like Carter came with gravity. Tamsin gestured. "Deputy Cray, Carter Voss. We're treating this as a missing persons situation with potential interference." Gideon's mouth tightened. "Interference like—" He stopped, seeing the trail camera in Tamsin's hand. "Oh, exactly," Tamsin said. "Mark the vehicle perimeter. Photos first. Then we check the utility shack." Gideon nodded, already pulling flag markers from his kit. "Copy. No one touches anything without gloves." Carter held his hands up slightly. "Understood." Gideon's eyes softened a fraction. "Good." Kepler, meanwhile, had returned to work. He moved along the tree line, nose sweeping like a searchlight. He stopped near a patch of snow where the surface looked less glittery and more dull, disturbed. He sniffed, then moved toward the power corridor, following a line that curved away from the SUV and deeper toward the cedar shadows. Tamsin watched Kepler's direction. "He's not interested in the car anymore," she murmured. "He's got something else." Carter's chest tightened. "He's leading." "Yes," Tamsin said, and then, very quietly, almost to herself, "And I'm listening." They moved together, leaving Gideon to document the SUV and flag the evidence. Tamsin walked with the key idea of law in her posture. Carter walked with the key idea of love in his lungs. Kepler walked with the key idea of certainty in his bones. The utility shack came into view after a quarter mile, an old structure half hidden by cedars, squat and weathered, set beside the power corridor like something forgotten and embarrassed to exist. Its tin roof was dusted with snow. The door was metal, painted a faded industrial green, with a padlock housing that looked newer than the rest, cleaner, less rusted. Carter's skin prickled. New plastic and machine oil again, faint but present, like a signature. Tamsin raised a hand, stopping him a few feet back. She studied the door. "No forced entry marks," she said, "but the lock looks Recently handled. Kepler approached, sniffed along the base of the door where cold air leaked out. His ears angled forward. He didn't growl this time. He whined, a soft, low sound that didn't belong to a tough dog. Carter's stomach dropped. That whine wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like Kepler knew what was on the other side mattered. Tamsin pulled the brass key from her glove and looked at the stamped tag in the light. CL-17. She glanced at Carter. "You stay behind me," she said. Carter's jaw flexed. "I will." She stepped forward, inserted the key into the lock housing, and paused, one beat, as if listening to the building itself. Then she turned it. The lock clicked. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a small sound that felt like the first crack in a frozen lake. Kepler held perfectly still, eyes on the door. Carter felt his heartbeat in his throat. Tamsin set her palm against the metal and leaned in, testing the resistance. The door didn't swing open. Something inside was holding it. Ice, a secondary latch, or weight. She looked back at Carter once, her expression unreadable but steady. "Whatever's in here," she said softly. "We do this clean." Carter nodded. His hands trembled once, then stilled. Kepler exhaled through his nose, a warm plume against the cold metal, and pressed his shoulder lightly to Carter's leg, as if reminding him to stay standing. Tamsin took a breath, braced her boot, and pushed again. The door shifted an inch. A thin line of darkness opened. Cold air seeped out, carrying that faint scent of machine oil. And something else, so subtle Carter couldn't name it, but his body understood anyway. Human presence, near, real, and waiting. The door gave another inch with a reluctant groan, like old metal waking from a long sleep. A thin wedge of darkness opened in front of Sheriff and Tamsin Lark, and the cold that spilled out wasn't the clean cold of winter air. It was the stale, trapped cold of a room that had been holding its breath for hours. Kepler stood so still his fur barely moved. 6 years old, black and tan with a dark saddle across his back, broad chest rising in slow, controlled breaths. His amber-brown eyes fixed on the narrow gap as if the darkness inside had a pulse, and he could hear it. One ear twitched toward Carter, then forward again, checking in, then returning to duty. Carter Voss felt his heartbeat climb into his throat. He stayed behind Tamsin like he'd promised, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides. His old olive-gray tactical shirt looked almost the same color as the cedars outside, frayed at the cuffs and shoulders, softened by too many winters. His combat pants, earth brown and moss green, hung with a slight sag of used gear, not for style but because life had made them that way. The cold should have found every seam and crawled under his skin, but Carter barely noticed the temperature. Fear made its own weather. Tamsin braced her boot and pushed again. The door shifted with a metallic sigh, then stopped, caught on something inside. "A secondary latch," she murmured, voice low and calm. "Or ice." Carter swallowed. "Can you—" "I can," she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Not unkind, professional. She leaned in, flashlight beams slicing into the darkness. Dust motes floated in the light like tiny ghosts. The interior smelled of pine resin and old rust, and underneath that, the faint edge of machine oil, fresh enough to be wrong. Tamsin didn't step in yet. She raised her voice just enough to carry. "Gordon Voss? Marion Voss?" she called. Silence answered first. Then, faint, nearly swallowed by the thick cold, came a sound that made Carter's lungs lock. A human cough. Not loud, not dramatic, just real. Kepler let out a soft whine, the kind he hadn't made since he was a pup, and Carter had first brought him home after a long, quiet deployment. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. A sound that said, "There, they're there." Carter's knees almost moved on their own. He forced himself to stay. Tamsin reached to her belt and pulled a small pry tool, compact and worn from use. She slid it into the gap, worked it with controlled pressure, and the door finally gave enough for her to slip a shoulder through. The metal scraped softly against the frame. No explosion of sound, no crash, just the quiet of something opening that didn't want to. Kepler stepped forward, then paused at the threshold, nose lifting. He didn't rush inside. He waited, like he understood the rules of rooms where danger and truth could share the same air. Tamsin entered first, slow and deliberate. Carter followed one step behind, careful not to touch the doorframe, careful not to leave a story where evidence needed to speak for itself. Inside, the shack was smaller than it looked from outside. A single-room utility station with a rusted stove in one corner and a long workbench on the other. Plastic crates sat stacked near the back wall. A tarp was folded on the floor. Stiff with a cold. The small window was covered in a film of frost, turning daylight into a dull gray smear. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no scattered tools. That somehow was worse, because it meant whatever happened here had been planned. Tamsin moved her light across the floor. Footprints, she said quietly, but not many. Carter's eyes tracked where her beam pointed. The snow tracked in near the door had melted into a thin wet patch on the concrete. 2 sets of boot prints, heavy, familiar, likely Gordon's. A smaller set, Marion's. And then, near the workbench, a faint smear where something had been dragged or shifted. Kepler trotted forward and stopped beside a stack of crates, head tilting as he listened. A whisper of fabric moved behind them. Tamsin crouched and angled her light between the crates. "Ma'am," she said softly, voice changing, less sheriff, more human. A face appeared in the beam like a photograph developing. Marion Voss sat on the floor with her back against the wall, wrapped in a coat that looked too thin for this kind of cold. She was in her mid-60s, small and quick-eyed even now. Her brown hair shot through with silver and pulled back messily, as if she'd tried to keep herself tidy in a place that didn't deserve manners. Her cheeks were pale, but there was still color in them, stubborn life refusing to be negotiated away. Her eyes blinked against the light, sharp with exhaustion, but unmistakably present. And next to her sat Gordon, late 60s, built like a man who had argued with machines for most of his life and usually won. His shoulders were slightly sloped from years of work, but his frame still carried that hard, quiet strength. His hands looked like tools, broad knuckles, thick fingers, nails permanently marked. Frost clung to the edge of his wool cap. His mouth was set in a line that said he'd been counting minutes and refusing to panic out of spite. When Gordon saw Carter, the line cracked. Not into a smile, into relief he didn't want to admit. Carter's vision blurred for a second. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until it rushed out of him like a confession. "Mom," he said, voice rough. Marion's lips twitched, the ghost of a grin. "You always show up when I look terrible," she rasped, humor thin but real. "It's your special talent." Carter dropped to his knees beside her, careful, so careful, hands hovering before he touched. The clean-shaven edge of his jaw tightened as he forced himself to move like a medic, not a son. Tamsin was already working, pulling an emergency blanket from her bag. "Cold exposure," she murmured, checking Marion's hands and Gordon's posture. "You both conscious? Any chest pain? Dizziness?" Gordon's voice came out gravelly but steady. "Cold, stiff, alive." "Good," Tamsin said. "We'll keep it that way." Kepler nosed Marion's shoulder gently, then pressed his forehead against her forearm. Marion's eyes softened, and her fingers, shaky but determined, scratched behind Kepler's ear. "Good boy," she whispered. "You found him." Kepler's tail gave one slow wag, restraining him like a soldier, trying not to show emotion in front of an officer. Then he turned his head toward Carter again, eyes steady, as if to say, "See? I told you." Carter touched Marion's hand. It was cold through the glove, but not lifeless. He squeezed carefully, like holding something fragile that still mattered. "What happened?" Carter asked. Gordon exhaled slowly, gaze drifting to the door as if he could still hear the moment it shut. "We came because of the notice," Gordon said. Tamsin's head lifted. "Notice? Where did you say?" Gordon nodded once. "A paper taped to the mailbox this morning. Said there was a power corridor check, ice risk, said to secure the utility access. Had a reference code on it." Carter's stomach tightened. The key, the mailbox, the clean little trap. Marion swallowed, voice thin. "When we thought it was the town, we thought it was normal." Gordon's jaw worked. "I used the key that was in the box, didn't think twice. Brought us here. Door shut behind us." "Locked?" Tamsin asked. Not locked, Gordon said. Jammed, like something was pressed against it. Couldn't get it open from inside. Carter's eyes flicked to the corner near the door. There, half hidden in shadow, was a length of old rope attached to a metal hook on the wall, and beneath it, an empty plastic wrap that looked like it once held hand warmers. That was a choice. Someone had wanted them cold, but not dead. Carter felt anger flare in his chest, hot and immediate, then fold into something darker. Whoever did this wasn't trying to kill. They were trying to shape, to stage, to make the world believe a version of events that served them. Tamsin's expression tightened, the smallest movement at the corner of her mouth. Did you see anyone? Marion's eyes shifted, searching memory through fatigue. A vehicle, a dark van maybe. It passed the corridor, slow. Gordon nodded, heard footsteps outside, then nothing. Kepler's ears twitched at the word footsteps, and he turned his head toward the door, muscles tightening in a ready stance. Tamsin reached for her radio. Lark to dispatch, she said, voice clipped. Found the missing persons alive at Cedar Line Utility Shack. Send EMS for cold exposure. Also send fire for assistance with door stabilization and transport. A burst of static, then, copy, Sheriff, EMS and fire en route. Carter swallowed hard and forced his voice steady. You're both coming home. Marion's smile flickered again. You say that like you own the weather. Gordon's eyes narrowed slightly, not at Carter, but at the room. This wasn't random, he said. Carter nodded once. I know. Kepler suddenly moved away from Marion and trotted toward the workbench. He sniffed along the edge, then stood on his hind legs, front paws braced lightly on the wood, and nudged something with his muzzle. A strip of red fabric dangled there, tied in a tight knot around a pipe, small, almost ridiculous in a room full of metal and cold. Carter recognized it immediately, not because it was special, because it was home. It was a torn piece of Marion's kitchen dish towel, red with a faded white stripe, the same towel she used to smack Gordon's shoulder when he tracked grease into her clean floor. Marion's eyes lifted to Carter, and something passed between them, a silent message delivered through cloth. I tied it, she whispered, by the door first. When it got stuck, I moved it, just in case. In case of what? Carter asked, though he already knew. In case someone came who wasn't you, Marion said softly. In case the world needed a sign that we were still here. Carter's throat tightened, not with fear this time, but with that strange ache that came when you realized your mother had been brave in a way you'd never fully thanked her for. Kepler nudged the cloth again, then looked up at Carter with an expression that was almost smug. The dog hadn't only found them. He'd found the story Marion left behind, proof that she hadn't simply waited. She'd chosen to be seen. Carter pressed his palm to the workbench for balance. The cold wood steadied him, and for a moment he felt the shape of something he'd forgotten existed in him. Faith, not in miracles, in people. Outside, the sound of engines approached, muffled by trees and snow. Tamsin guided Gordon up slowly, supporting his elbow. Carter did the same for Marion, wrapping the emergency blanket tighter around her shoulders. She shivered, but her eyes stayed sharp. Kepler moved in small arcs around them, positioning his body between them and the door, then between them and the window, instinctively guarding angles like he'd been trained, even if no one had officially trained him for this. Footsteps crunched outside. A knock sounded on the metal doorframe, careful and respectful. Sheriff, a man's voice called. Fire and EMS. Tamsin opened the door wider, letting in a wash of bright daylight that made the shack feel even smaller. A volunteer fire captain stepped into view, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a shaved head and a thick auburn mustache that made him look like a friendly bear in turnout gear. His name patch read Captain Haskins. His eyes were tired but kind, the look of someone who'd been woken up at odd hours for years and still came anyway. Captain Lorne Haskins, he introduced quickly, nodding at Carter and the couple. We'll get them warmed and moved. You folks did good finding them. Behind him, a paramedic, Renee Kessler, late 20s, slim and brisk, stepped forward with a medical bag. She had pale skin flushed pink from cold, dark blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, and a focused expression that didn't waste time on fear. She checked Marion's pulse, then Gordon's, speaking in calm, efficient phrases like a person who believes steadiness could be contagious. "You're both lucky," Renee said gently. "We're going to keep you that way." Carter watched his parents being assessed, the reality of it settling into his bones. They were here. They were alive. But the room still smelled faintly of machine oil, and the empty hand warmer wrapper lay like a quiet confession near the door. Someone had planned their survival. Someone had planned Carter's arrival. Tamsin caught Carter's gaze. Her face didn't soften, but her voice did. "This was designed," she said quietly, "which means whoever did it expects us to react. We won't give them sloppy." Carter nodded once, jaw tight. "Clean." Kepler sat at Marion's side as they guided her toward the door, eyes scanning the bright world outside, as if he didn't trust sunlight anymore. Not because of superstition, but because he'd learned today that daylight could hide a lie. As they stepped out into the cold brightness, Marion turned her head toward Carter. Her voice was thin, but steady. "Carter," she said. He leaned closer. Marion's eyes held his, blue-gray, tired, stubborn, loving. "Don't let them make you into someone you're not," she whispered. Carter's throat tightened. He nodded because words were too fragile for what he felt. Kepler rose and pressed his shoulder against Carter's leg, grounding him like an anchor. The sun glittered across the snow, beautiful, sharp, uncaring. And Carter Voss, standing between his rescued parents and the silent cedar line, understood one thing with chilling clarity. This wasn't a storm. This was a message, and he was going to answer it, carefully. The rescue did not end with sirens. It ended with breath. Warm air, thin and precious, leaving Marion Voss's mouth in small clouds as Captain Haskins guided her into the back of the ambulance. The winter sun glittered on the snowbanks like 1,000 watching eyes, and Carter Voss hated how beautiful it all looked. Beauty should have belonged to safer days. Kepler stayed glued to Marion's side, his broad black and tan body moving with restrained urgency. 6 years old, strong-chested and steady-limbed, he did not pace like a panicked pet. He moved like a guard who'd accepted a post and refused to abandon it. His amber-brown eyes kept flicking between Marion's face and Carter's, as if tracking the bond between them like a rope that must not fray. Carter followed the ambulance to town in his truck, hands steady on the wheel, knuckles pale. He drove as if the road might shatter if he hit a bump too hard. The old military watch on his wrist ticked on, indifferent, as if time were a who never learned mercy. In the rearview mirror, the cedar line fell away. But the sense of being designed did not. That snapped in the wind like an impatient warning. Inside, warmth hit Carter's face and made his eyes sting, an ordinary sensation that felt undeserved. Sheriff Tamsin Lark moved through the doorway first, radio clipped to her shoulder, posture unchanged. Her calm had weight, like a stone you could lean against when everything else slid. She spoke in low, clean sentences to Renee Kessler, the paramedic, quick updates, practical priorities, then turned to Carter. "Before you say it," Tamsin murmured, "yes, you can stay, but you don't touch anything we're treating as evidence. Understood?" Carter nodded once, his clean-shaven jaw flexed, the square bone and sharp cheekbones making him look carved rather than grown. "Understood." Kepler tried to follow Marion down the hallway. A voice stopped him. Quiet, firm, not unkind. "Easy there, soldier." A woman stepped out of a side room holding a clipboard and a small veterinary kit. Dr. Piper Wren looked about 38, average height, built practical rather than delicate. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a low bun that had started to loosen, strands escaping like they were tired of discipline. Her skin was pale with a winter flush across her cheeks, and her eyes were a clear gray that held steady under pressure. The kind of eyes that had seen injured animals dragged in by storms and still managed to speak gently. Her parka was charcoal gray, zipped high, with a black turtleneck visible at the collar. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew panic never healed a wound. "You brought the big guy too," Piper said, glancing at Kepler with professional appreciation. "Good, I want to look at his paws." Kepler lifted his head and stared at her like she'd just proposed a ridiculous idea. "I'm fine," then gave a soft huff and allowed her to approach. Piper crouched, letting Kepler sniff her gloved hand before she touched him, respecting the language of animals the way good people did. "Smart boy," she murmured, checking his front pads. "You've got ice cuts. Nothing dramatic, but enough to hurt." Kepler did not whine. He did not flinch. He only glanced toward Marion's hallway again, as if asking permission from his own heart. Piper saw the glance. Her expression softened. "We'll be quick," she promised, as if speaking to both dog and man. Carter watched and felt something tighten in his chest. Kepler was tough, but this wasn't toughness. This was devotion. And devotion, Carter realized, was the most dangerous thing in the world, because it made you care even when caring hurt. Marion and Gordon lay in adjacent exam bays, wrapped in warmed blankets, while nurses checked vitals. Marion's humor was still alive, flickering like a pilot light. When Carter stepped in, she rasped, "You look like you wrestled a snowbank and lost." Carter tried for a smile. It came out crooked. The snowbank was bigger. Gordon Voss sat propped up, wool cap removed, gray hair flattened. His face looked older under fluorescent light. Lines deep, skin weathered, eyes stubborn. His hands rested on the blanket, fingers thick and scarred, the hands of a man who'd spent a lifetime making broken things behave. He looked at Carter for a long moment. "You came fast," Gordon said finally. Carter swallowed. Not fast enough." Gordon's gaze sharpened. "Don't." The single word carried decades of fatherhood. Don't punish yourself for things you couldn't control. Marion, hearing it, made a small sound like a laugh, and a sigh got tangled. "Your father's pretending he's not relieved," she whispered, stage dramatic. "Don't tell him I said that." Gordon's mouth twitched once, almost a smile. Almost. Tamsin stood in the doorway, arms crossed, posture steady. "Gordon," she said, voice gentle but direct, "talk me through the notice again. Exactly what it looked like." Gordon's brow furrowed. "White paper, typed, too clean for something stuck to a mailbox in this weather. It had a reference code, said corridor ice risk and utility access. It looked official." Marion's eyes narrowed. "But it didn't feel official." "How so?" Tamsin asked. Marion hesitated, then shrugged weakly. "It was polite, too polite, like someone pretending to be the town." Carter felt cold creep up his spine that had nothing to do with winter, a trap that wore manners. Tamsin nodded once. "Did you keep it?" Gordon's eyes shifted away. Silence, brief but heavy. Carter knew that silence. It was the sound of a man weighing pride against practicality. "I did," Gordon admitted, "in my coat." Tamsin held out a gloved hand. "I need it." Gordon sighed and fished into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded sheet, edges crisp, too crisp, and handed it over. Tamsin studied it. Her eyes moved fast, reading not only the words, but the shape of the lie. Then her gaze dropped to the bottom corner. There was no town seal, no signature, only a printed line, Cedar Line Compliance Unit. Tamsin's jaw tightened. "We don't have a compliance unit." Carter's stomach turned. Kepler, who had been lying quietly near the door, suddenly lifted his head. Not toward Marion, not toward the hallway, toward Gordon's hands. Kepler rose, walked over, and pressed his nose to Gordon's knuckles with slow insistence, as if smelling for a truth the words weren't carrying. Gordon stiffened. "What's with him?" Piper, still nearby, glanced up from her kit. "Dogs remember what humans try to forget," she said softly, almost to herself. Kepler nudged Gordon's hand again, then turned and pointed his muzzle at Gordon's coat pocket, the one that had held the notice. Gordon stared at the dog. A strange, rueful affection flickered in his eyes. "All right," Gordon muttered. "All right." He reached into the pocket again and pulled out something he hadn't offered the sheriff. A small, worn notebook, thin, dark cover, edges softened by years. The kind of object that looked harmless until you realized people hid dangerous things in ordinary skins. Carter's pulse stuttered. Tamsin's eyes sharpened. "What is that?" Gordon's voice went rough. "A piece of my past." Marion closed her eyes briefly, like she'd been waiting for this moment for years and still didn't want it. Carter stared at the notebook and felt a deep, unwelcome understanding. The trap wasn't only about today. It was about what the Voss family had carried quietly. and what someone had decided to drag into the light. Tamsin held out her hand again, slower now. Gordon, I need to know. Gordon's shoulders sagged a fraction, an old man finally setting down a weight. It's not the whole thing, he said. Just notes, reference codes, old deliveries. Deliveries of what? Carter asked, voice tight. Gordon's eyes met his. Back when the mine was still alive, shipments came through. Some were honest, some weren't. Men got paid to stop asking questions. Carter felt anger flare, hot, immediate, then collapse into confusion. Dad, don't, Gordon said again, sharper this time. Not like that. I didn't do anything illegal. I kept track because I didn't trust the people who said, forget it. Marion's voice was thin but steady. Your father kept notes because he's stubborn. I let him because I'm tired of burying things that still breathe. Tamsin glanced toward the hallway where Deputy Gideon Cray had been waiting with evidence forms. We need chain of custody, she said. If this connects to Halcrow's network, it becomes bigger than Ironhaven. Carter's throat tightened at the name. Halcrow, the man with the calm smile and the eyes like broken glass. Piper watched Carter's face with a clinician's quiet insight. Whatever you're carrying, she said gently, don't let it make you cruel. Carter didn't answer. Kepler sat at his boot, leaning his shoulder into Carter's shin, an anchor with fur. Tamsin took the notebook carefully, sealed it in an evidence sleeve, and nodded once at Gideon to log it. But Gordon spoke again, voice low. That's not the main ledger, he admitted. Carter's head snapped up. There's more? Gordon looked away, ashamed and furious at the same time. The real ledger is hidden, old boathouse near the frozen lake. I put it there years ago. Thought it would die with me. Tamsin's gaze hardened. We can't leave it there now. Gordon nodded, exhausted. I know. Marion added, almost whispering, someone already knows. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come for us so neatly. Carter's mind raced. If someone wanted the ledger, they wanted either to destroy it or rewrite its meaning. And if they wanted to rewrite meaning, they wanted Carter's name pinned somewhere on the page like a stain. Tamsin exhaled. We go now, she decided, while it's still daylight. Carter stood, body moving on instinct. I'm coming. Tamsin's eyes cut to him. You don't touch the ledger. You don't carry it. You don't become part of the evidence. Carter's jaw clenched. Then he nodded. Clean. Kepler rose too, as if now applied to him more than anyone. Piper handed Carter a small roll of vet wrap. For his paw pads, she said. He won't complain, but he'll bleed if you push him too hard. Carter took it carefully. Thank you. Piper's gaze held his, steady and human. Bring them back whole, she said, not only meaning the dog. They reached the lake just as the sun began to tilt. Ice stretched out like a pale mirror under the sky, and the old boathouse sat at the edge of it, weathered boards and a door that looked like it had forgotten what it was built for. Snow drifted against its base in soft banks. The air tasted like iron and pine in distance. Kepler trotted ahead, then slowed. He sniffed the boathouse door seam. His body went still. Not fearful, alert. Tamsin saw it too. She lifted a hand, stopping Carter and Gideon. What is it? Carter whispered. Kepler's ears angled forward, his tail held steady. Then he stepped sideways and stared at the snow near the foundation. Carter followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. The snow there was disturbed, subtle, but real. A smear, a compressed patch, the faint print of a boot toe where the powder had been pressed down. Fresh enough that the wind hadn't erased it, Tamsin's voice went quiet. We're not first. Gideon swallowed, face pale under his knit cap. Sheriff, if someone's already accessed it. I know, Tamsin said. She drew a breath. Photos, then we retrieve. Then we lock down. Carter stared at the boathouse and felt the old war inside him shift. This wasn't gunfire. This was paperwork with teeth. Kepler pawed once at a loose plank near the base, then stepped back. Carter didn't touch it. He simply looked at Tamsin. Tamsin nodded and, with gloved hands, lifted the plank carefully. Inside was a sealed metal box. Gideon photographed it. Then Tamsin lifted it out like it weighed more than steel. She set it on the snow, opened it slowly. A thick ledger lay inside, old paper, bound spine, the kind of record that made men nervous. Tamsin flipped it open just enough to see the first pages, and then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. A section was missing, cleanly removed, not torn in panic. Carter's chest tightened. Pages. Tamsin nodded, face grim. Someone's been editing history. Kepler let out a low huff and sat beside Carter, gaze fixed on the dark doorway of the boathouse, as if waiting for the ghost editor to reveal itself. Tamsin closed the box, sealed it, and handed it to Gideon. "We're done here," she said. "We move now." Carter looked back once at the lake, the frozen expanse reflecting the sky like an unblinking eye. He had brought his parents home. But the truth, whatever it was, had already been touched. And somewhere in Iron Haven, someone believed they could decide what Carter Voss became next. Kepler pressed his shoulder into Carter's leg. A quiet reminder, not if we stay awake. By the time the ledger reached the sheriff's office, the sun was already sliding lower. Still bright, still beautiful, but angled now, turning every snowbank into a blade of light. Iron Haven Station was small-town practical, a brick building that smelled faintly of old coffee and copier toner, with a single American flag out front snapping in the wind like a warning that never slept. Inside, warmth hummed through baseboard heaters, and the walls held framed photos of past deputies, faces that looked like they'd learned, slowly, that justice was less a sword and more a shovel. Sheriff Tamsin Lark moved with that same shovel steadiness. She placed the sealed metal box on a table as if it were holy and hazardous at once. Her winter jacket was still on, dark and heavy, badge catching the overhead light like a cold star. Her eyes, green-gray, calm, relentless, tracked every hand that came close. Deputy Gideon Cray set up a tripod and camera without being told. Mid-30s, sandy hair cut short, neatly trimmed stubble, and a mind built like a filing cabinet that never forgot where it put a lie. He logged times and seals and signatures with the seriousness of a man who believed paperwork was the last fence between truth and chaos. Carter Voss stood slightly back, exactly where Tamsin wanted him, close enough to witness, far enough to avoid being woven into the evidence. He hated it. Not because he didn't understand, he did. He understood too well. He just wasn't used to battles fought with pens. Kepler sat at Carter's boot like a shadow that chose loyalty over comfort. 6 years old, black and tan coat with a dark saddle, broad chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. His paws were wrapped in fresh vet bandage, and he carried the wraps with offended dignity, as if the only thing worse than pain was looking like he needed help. Tamsin flipped the ledger open with gloved hands. The missing section stared back at them like a tooth knocked clean out of a jaw. Gideon swore quietly, not profanity, just a breath shaped into frustration. "It's a removal," he murmured, "not a tear. Whoever did it had time." Carter's jaw tightened. The clean-shaven angles of his face made him look carved, and in his gray-blue eyes there was the same steel he'd carried into places where steel was the only language that mattered. "They were here before us," Carter said. Tamsin didn't look up. "Yes." "And they wanted us to know," Carter added. Tamsin closed the ledger carefully. "Also, yes." Her voice stayed even, but Carter saw the muscle jump once in her cheek. Not fear, anger, disciplined anger, the kind that wore a badge and still had teeth. Gideon slid a chain of custody form across the table. "Sheriff, I'll lock this in the evidence room safe. Only you and I have access." "Good," Tamsin said. Then after a beat, "And nobody says the word Halcrow out loud in public until we choose the moment." Carter's shoulders lifted with a slow inhale. Halcrow's name sat in his chest like a thorn. He'd thought the arrest would end the story. Instead, it had merely opened the next page. The front door chimed, bright, almost cheerful, as if the building had never seen grief. A man stepped in with the smoothness of someone who had never had to hurry. He wore a charcoal wool coat that looked too expensive for Iron Haven's salt-stained sidewalks, and a thin gray scarf laid neatly at his throat like a signature. His hair was dark with streaks of silver at the temples, combed back with exactness. His face was angular, clean, and controlled. No beard, no softness, only the polite sharpness of someone who lived by rules he could bend for a fee. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had never been set down in snow. "Sheriff Lark," he said, voice warm enough to sound human. Grant Sutter, counsel. Tamsin's gaze sharpened. Counsel for who? Sutter's smile held. Not friendly, professional. A party with an interest in ensuring your department follows procedure. Gideon stiffened, pen hovering above the custody form like a stopped heartbeat. Carter's body reacted before his mind did. Weight shifting, shoulders squaring, instincts stepping forward. Kepler, sensing the change, lifted his head. His ears angled towards Sutter. His nostrils flared once, subtle and quick. Sutter's eyes flicked to the dog, then away, as if refusing to grant an animal the dignity of being read. Tamsin stepped closer, keeping herself between Sutter and the evidence table. "This is a missing persons case," she said evenly. "My department followed a procedure." Sutter opened his briefcase and produced a crisp letter on heavy paper. "Then you won't mind my presence," he said. "There have been allegations. Unlawful entry, unlawful seizure, a decorated former SEAL inserting himself into an active investigation." Carter's stomach tightened. The trap wasn't a rope. It wasn't a weapon. It was a narrative. Sutter's eyes found Carter's, and for a second his politeness thinned into something else. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "You're Carter Voss," he said, as if tasting the name. "I've heard you prefer direct solutions." Carter didn't blink. "I prefer clean ones." Sutter smiled again. "How noble." Tamsin's voice stayed calm, but it carried iron. "Mr. Sutter, you can file your concerns with the county prosecutor. You don't get to wander my station." Sutter lifted a hand in a gentle surrender that somehow felt like a threat. "Of course," he said. "I simply wanted to ensure your next steps are cautious." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back with the mild interest of a man watching a storm form over a lake. "Oh," he added lightly, "the town's holding the Ice Lantern Walk this afternoon. Crowds, cameras, people talking. It would be a shame if someone misunderstood your department's work." Then he walked out into the bright snow as if he owned the sunlight. Carter stared at the door long after it closed. Tamsin exhaled slowly. "That," she said, "is pressure." Gideon swallowed. "He's Hal Crow's lawyer." Tamsin didn't confirm it. She didn't have to. Carter's throat felt tight. "He wants me to make a mistake." "Yes," Tamsin said. "So don't." Kepler stood and pressed his shoulder into Carter's shin, grounding him. Carter looked down, and for a moment the hardness in his face cracked into something almost tender. "Okay," Carter murmured to the dog. "Clean." The Ice Lantern Walk was a tradition Ironhaven had invented to survive its own winters. By late afternoon, the town square filled with families in thick coats and knit caps. Ice sculptures stood like glittering beasts, wolves, eagles, a moose with antlers carved so sharp they looked dangerous. Rows of lanterns in colored glass lined the sidewalks, unlit in daylight but still beautiful, like faith waiting for dusk. It was bright. It was festive. It was the kind of scene that made people believe nothing bad could happen in a place like this. Carter stood at the edge of the crowd with Kepler at his heel, watching faces, not because he distrusted everyone, because he distrusted the stories someone was trying to write about him. Tamsin moved through the square with Gideon a few steps behind, both in plain winter gear rather than full uniform. Less authority, more observation. Less law, more buying eyes. Marion and Gordon were home resting, warmed and stubbornly alive. Marion had joked, through chattering teeth, that if anyone tried to scare her again, they should at least bring cocoa. Gordon had grunted like humor was a foreign language, but his eyes had softened. Carter held those small moments inside him like embers. Kepler's head lifted. His posture changed, not aggressive, not panicked, focused. He sniffed once, then twice, then angled his body subtly to block Carter's path. Carter frowned. "What is it, boy?" Kepler didn't look at him. He stared past Carter's shoulder toward a booth near the corner of the square. A safety booth, a clean banner stretched across it, Cedar Line Compliance. The words hit Carter like a cold hand on the spine. Behind the table stood a man in a navy beanie and reflective vest, handing out pamphlets with cheerful efficiency. He looked ordinary. 30s, pale skin, brown beard trimmed short, a friendly smile practiced to perfection. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting. But Kepler did not forget. Kepler's ears flattened slightly, and a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Not a growl meant to threaten, but a warning meant to communicate. This is wrong. Carter felt his pulse quicken. Tamsin saw the booth too. Her eyes narrowed, and the calm on her face became something sharper. "Don't move fast," she murmured when she reached Carter's side. "Let them think they're invisible." Gideon's gaze flicked to Carter. "That's the same wording as the notice." Carter nodded once, mouth dry. "They're here." The bearded man at the booth glanced up, meeting Carter's eyes for half a second. Then his friendly smile tightened, and he looked away too quickly. A child, maybe 7, ran between adults carrying a paper lantern shaped like a star. The lantern bobbed, bright against the snow. Kepler stepped forward suddenly, not lunging, not panicking, just placing his body between Carter and the child's path with a calm, immovable certainty. The child bumped gently into Kepler's shoulder and stopped, startled. "Sorry," the child blurted, eyes wide. Carter reached down automatically, steadying the lantern so it wouldn't crumple. His gloved fingers brushed the paper, and he felt something inside it. Hard, rectangular, not part of the lantern's frame. Carter's breath caught. He glanced up. No one around them seemed to notice. Everyone was laughing at an ice wolf sculpture, phones held up, faces turned away. Kepler stared at Carter with an expression that was almost stern. "Look closer." Carter slid 2 fingers into the bottom seam of the lantern and found a thin plastic sleeve taped inside, small enough to hide, heavy enough to matter. A memory stick, or a micro SD card, a piece of truth disguised as a child's decoration. Carter's chest tightened with a strange mixture of anger and awe. Whoever was playing this game didn't just want evidence. They wanted theatrical control. They wanted Carter to be seen holding the wrong thing at the wrong time. Carter didn't pull it out. He didn't expose it. He simply closed his hand around the lantern's base and guided it back to the child gently. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice warm so the kid wouldn't feel the cold behind it. "Take this back to your mom, okay? Don't run with it." The child nodded quickly and darted away. Kepler stayed planted until the child was gone, then exhaled through his nose like a soldier who just watched a bomb get carried past a crowd. Tamsin's eyes were on Carter now, sharp, questioning. Carter whispered, barely moving his lips, "There's something hidden in the lantern." Tamsin's face didn't change, but her gaze hardened like ice thickening. "Good," she murmured. "Now we know their style." At the booth, the bearded man was packing pamphlets faster than before. "Gideon," Tamsin said quietly, "photograph the banner. Don't confront." Gideon lifted his phone, snapped 2 quick shots, then slipped it away. Carter watched the bearded man step behind the booth and murmur something to a second person. Just a shadowed figure in a dark hood, face turned away. Kepler's head tracked the hooded figure with precise focus. Carter felt heat rise in his chest, the old urge to move fast and end it, to stop playing chess and start flipping the table. But Marion's whisper from the shack echoed in his memory. "Don't let them make you into someone you're not." He swallowed the heat. He stayed clean. Tamsin leaned closer to Carter, voice soft. "We leave the square," she said. "We don't give them a scene." Carter's jaw tightened. "And the booth?" "We log it. We follow later with warrants," Tamsin said. "Because if we grab them here, in public, with Hal Crow's lawyer circling, they'll call it harassment," Gideon finished, grim. Tamsin nodded once. "Exactly." Kepler gave a quiet huff, as if offended by patience, but he followed when Carter stepped back. They moved away from the crowd, the lanterns and laughter fading behind them. The town's brightness suddenly felt fragile, like glass over deep water. Carter's phone vibrated. One new message. Unknown number. 6 words. "Good dog." Same as Kandahar. Carter stopped walking. The world didn't tilt. It sharpened. Kandahar wasn't just a place. It was a chapter of his life written in sand and smoke, a chapter he rarely let himself reread. Very few people knew what he'd done there. Fewer still would joke about it. Kepler looked up at Carter, amber eyes steady, ears forward. Tamsin turned, saw Carter's face, and didn't ask what the message said. She didn't need to. Her own instincts, honed in a different kind of war, recognized the shift. "Someone from your past," she said quietly. Carter's throat tightened. He nodded once. Gideon swallowed. "Sheriff, this is bigger than Ironhaven." Tamsin's gaze moved from Carter to Kepler to the fading lantern-lined square. "Yes," she said, "and that means we don't get sloppy. Not now." Carter stared at the message again. Then he locked the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket as if burying a spark. He looked down at Kepler. The dog stood close, bandaged paws, broad chest, unwavering posture, like a myth that had decided to become real. Carter exhaled slowly. "Let's go," he murmured, not as an order, as a vow. And in the bright northern cold, with a town celebrating light behind them and a shadowed enemy writing stories ahead, Carter Voss walked on, clean-handed, eyes open, and no longer alone in his certainty. Night came to Ironhaven the way winter night always came, quietly, as if it didn't want to startle the snow. The town's lanterns still glowed along the square, soft colors trapped in glass like prayers held in cupped hands. Laughter had faded into doorways. Boots had carried families home. The ice lantern walk had done what it was meant to do. Convince people that light was something you could schedule. But Carter Voss knew better. Light, like truth, didn't always show up on time. He sat in the passenger seat of Sheriff Tamsin Lark's SUV while she drove, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes measuring every turn. The road reflected moonlight in sharp strips. Kepler lay in the back, bandaged paws tucked under his chest, ears twitching at every passing sound. Even resting, the German shepherd seemed to guard the space between breaths. Carter's phone felt like a live coal in his pocket. He didn't check it again. The message about Kandahar sat in his mind anyway, lodged behind his ribs like a splinter he couldn't pull out without bleeding. Tamsin broke the silence first. "You did well out there," she said. Carter's jaw flexed, clean-shaven, sharp angles, gray-blue eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't do the wrong thing," Tamsin corrected. "That matters." Carter exhaled slowly through his nose. It wasn't the kind of answer a man like him liked. He'd built his adult life on action, decisive, physical, measurable. Now he was being told the victory was in restraint. It felt like being asked to win a war by refusing to fire. Kepler shifted in the back, and Carter glanced over his shoulder. The dog's amber-brown eyes met his for a moment, steady as an oath. Kepler's black and tan coat was darker in the cab's dim light, the saddle across his back like a shadow that had chosen loyalty. Carter swallowed. Maybe restraint was action, just quieter. The sheriff's station was warm and small and smelled faintly of paper and coffee that had been reheated one time too many. Deputy Gideon Cray was waiting inside, already in motion, as if his nervous system had been built around forms and deadlines. Gideon was mid-30s, lean under his uniform coat, sandy brown hair kept short, stubble trimmed neat enough to look intentional. His eyes were the color of weak coffee, always scanning, always counting. He'd grown up in a place like Ironhaven. Carter could tell by the way Gideon treated procedure like religion. Maybe it was the only thing that ever kept a small town from becoming a rumor. On a table sat the sealed metal box and the ledger inside it, waiting like a witness who refused to forget. Tamsin removed her gloves and spoke in a low voice. "We need a warrant for the booth and for anyone operating under that compliance banner." Gideon nodded quickly. "I already typed the affidavit draft. We'll need a prosecutor to sign off." As if summoned by the word, the front door chimed again. A woman entered with a kind of presence that didn't need a badge. Elena Markham was in her early 50s, tall and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair cut into a blunt bob that framed a face built of clean lines and tired intelligence. Her skin was olive pale under the fluorescent lights, and her eyes, dark hazel, sharp, held the steady impatience of someone who had spent years watching people lie badly in rooms full of microphones. She wore a simple wool coat over a charcoal suit, no jewelry except a thin wedding band. Her hands held a folder like it weighed more than paper. "Sheriff," Elena said, nodding once at Tamsin. Her gaze flicked to Carter. measured him in half a heartbeat, then moved on. Deputy? County prosecutor, Gideon answered, respectful. His voice always sounded a little younger around people who could ruin careers with a pen stroke. Elena set her folder on the table, opened it, and took in the ledger's sealed box with a look that said she'd seen this kind of trouble before. Trouble that arrived politely and then ate a town from the inside out. Grant Sutter paid me a visit, Elena said. Tamsin's face didn't change, but the air in the room did. Of course he did. Elena's mouth tightened. He's circling, Sheriff. He wants missteps. He wants a headline. He wants to claim misconduct before you've even finished your first sentence. Carter felt heat rise in his chest, the old instinct to confront, to end the game by breaking the board. He kept his hands still. Tamsin nodded once. We stay clean. Elena's gaze landed on Carter, this time with more weight. And you, she said, voice even, you stay out of the frame. Carter met her eyes. That's the plan. Elena didn't smile, but something like respect touched her expression. Good, because whoever is doing this isn't just hiding. They're composing. Composing what? Carter asked. Elena tapped the folder lightly. A story, one where the sheriff is reckless, the seal is unhinged, and the evidence is contaminated. Gideon swallowed. The missing pages. Elena raised a hand. We'll get there, but first, affidavits, warrants, documentation. We move like ice forming, slow, invisible, unstoppable. Carter almost laughed at the metaphor. Almost, Ironhaven winter teaching its own law. Kepler from the corner huffed once as if to say he preferred unstoppable to slow, but he stayed quiet. An hour later, Carter stood on his parents' porch with Kepler at his side, the night air cold enough to sting his lungs. The house was lit from inside, soft and golden, like someone had poured warmth into it and refused to let it spill. Marion Voss sat in an armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket so thick it made her look like a small queen under siege. Her hair, brown with silver, had come loose from its tie, framing a face that was still quick-eyed despite exhaustion. When she saw Carter, she lifted an eyebrow. You missed dinner, she said, voice raspy but alive. I'm adding that to your permanent record. Carter's shoulders loosened a fraction. I'll accept the penalty. Gordon sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug. He looked steadier now, color returning to his weathered face. But there was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Pride, regret, and something else. Recognition that the past never stayed buried just because a man got tired. Kepler padded over to Marion first, nose nudging her blanket. Marion scratched behind his ear with a weak hand. My hero, she murmured. Try not to get frostbite showing off. Kepler's tail gave one slow wag. Carter could have sworn the dog's expression looked smug. Carter sat on the edge of the couch. Prosecutor Markham's involved now, he told them. We're doing this by the book. Gordon grunted. Books didn't stop men from coming for us. No, Carter said softly, but books can stop them from rewriting what happened. Marion's eyes softened. That's my boy, she whispered. Then, because she was Marion, she added, even when you talk like a documentary narrator. Carter let out a short breath that almost counted as laughter. For a moment, the house felt like it used to, small jokes as shields against big storms. Then Kepler's head lifted, his ears pricked, his body went still. Not alarmed, not aggressive, focused. Carter's skin prickled. What is it? Kepler looked toward the front door. Then very deliberately, he stood and walked to the welcome mat. He lowered his nose and inhaled. Once. Twice. Then he pawed at the mat as if it offended him. Carter rose, heart kicking. Kepler! The dog pawed again, harder. Something scraped faintly under the mat. Carter froze. He reached down slowly and lifted the edge. There, wedged beneath like a secret someone didn't want the wind to steal, was an envelope. No stamp, no return address, just Carter's name written in block letters, careful and plain. Marion's breath caught. Gordon's mug paused halfway to his lips. Kepler sat back, eyes locked on the envelope, as if the dog had delivered it personally from fate's mailbox. Carter didn't touch it with bare hands. He grabbed a clean kitchen glove from the counter, slid it on, and lifted the envelope by its corner. It felt cold, newly placed. His throat tightened. Tamsin needs to see this. Marion's voice was thin. Open it? Carter hesitated, then shook his head once. Not here. Not like this. He set it carefully on the table as if it might bite. Kepler pressed his shoulder into Carter's thigh, grounding him, reminding him to breathe. Carter's phone buzzed. This time it was Tamsin. He answered immediately. Voss, Tamsin said, tell me you're at home. I am, Carter replied, and something just showed up under my mat. A pause. Not fear, calculation. Don't open it, Tamsin said. I'm coming. Gideon too. We bag it here and now. Carter swallowed. Understood. He looked down at the envelope again, the ordinary paper sitting on the kitchen table like a spell. Marion tried to make a joke, but it came out small. At least they have nice handwriting. Gordon's eyes stayed hard. They want you to touch it. Carter nodded once. They want me to be the story. Kepler stared at the envelope without blinking. For the first time, Carter understood what the dog had been doing all day. Kepler wasn't just tracking people. Kepler was tracking intent. Tamsin arrived within 15 minutes, moving like a storm contained in a uniform. Gideon followed, carrying evidence bags and a camera, face tight with the seriousness of someone who knew one sloppy fingerprint could turn justice into a circus. They photographed the envelope where it sat. They gloved up. They bagged it. Elena Markham arrived last, coat still buttoned, eyes tired but sharp. She watched Carter's parents, two older people wrapped in blankets and stubbornness, and something softened briefly in her gaze. Someone is bold, Elena said quietly. Or desperate, Tamsin replied. Gideon opened the envelope in view of the camera, careful as a surgeon. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a ledger page, old, yellowed, edges clean, where it had been cut free, and a note typed, plain, merciless in its simplicity. Next time, don't trust the badge. Carter felt the sentence hit like winter air down his lungs. Marion's hand rose to her mouth. Gordon's eyes shut for one beat, as if swallowing something bitter. Tamsin stared at the note, expression unreadable. Elena took the page carefully and scanned it. Then she went very still. This isn't just a page, Elena said. It's a message and a trigger. What do you mean? Carter asked. Elena held the page up to the light. There were codes, dates, delivery references, enough to ruin careers, enough to build cases. And in the corner, a small symbol in pen, an angled mark, almost like a check, something someone had added later. Elena's voice lowered. They return to peace to control what we chase. They want us to move towards something and away from something else. Kepler let out a low huff, as if he'd like to vote against being controlled. Carter's hands curled into fists, then relaxed deliberately. Clean. Tamsin met Carter's eyes. Her voice was soft, steady. This is where people like you break, she said, because it feels personal. It is personal, Carter replied. Yes, Tamsin said, but we still do it clean. Carter looked at Marion. She was trembling, not from cold this time. Her eyes held his, fierce with love. Don't let them turn you, she whispered. Carter nodded once. The nod felt like a vow. Kepler pressed his head against Carter's knee, and Carter rested his palm on the dog's neck. Warm fur under cold light. Outside, the town's lanterns glowed through the window like distant stars. Inside, one missing page had returned, not as a gift, as a dare. And Carter Voss, who had spent his life learning how to survive storms, sat at his family's table and chose for the first time in years not just to endure the cold, but to protect the light without letting it blind him. In the brightest daylight, it was easy to believe that danger only comes in storms. But this story reminds us that fear can arrive quietly, dressed as something ordinary. And the real battle is not only to survive it, but to stay true while you do. Carter could have answered darkness with rage. He could have let grief and pressure pull him into the kind of mistake that ruins a life. Instead, he chose something harder. Restraint, integrity, and love. That choice is where the miracle lives. Not in a sudden flash of lightning, but in a steady heart that refuses to be twisted. And then there was Kepler, a loyal German shepherd with no words, only instinct and devotion. Sometimes God sends help in ways we don't expect. Sometimes he sends a protector with four paws and a brave spirit, a reminder that heaven can whisper through creation itself. When humans are overwhelmed, God can use the simplest creature to guide us back toward what matters most. In everyday life, we face quieter tests too. A rumor at work, a misunderstanding in the family, a moment when we feel provoked, cornered, or tempted to react in a way we'll regret. This story asks a simple question. When the pressure rises, will you become what the world tries to make you, or will you become who God designed you to be? If you've ever felt like life was trying to write a false story about you, remember this. You can choose the truth. You can choose patience. You can choose to protect your heart without hardening it. And that choice, repeated day after day, is a kind of miracle. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story spoke to you most. And if you want more stories about loyalty, faith, and the quiet miracles that still happen in this world, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps. And may He send you the right help at the right time, even if it comes in an unexpected form.